Chosen one. When heaven delivers a decree, no force beneath can overturn it. That's not poetry, it's law in the spirit realm. And someone just collided with that truth headfirst. You, the chosen one, were once the scapegoat, the exile, the misunderstood soul quietly standing in the eye of chaos, absorbing tempests you never caused. They dragged your name through shadows, assuming no light would ever defend you. They mistook your stillness for submission. But then something ruptured, and it wasn't your spirit. It was their illusion. Because now, someone is speaking for you with a kind of holy fire they've never been scorched by before. And no, it's not your cousin posting quotes. It's someone with reach, records, and no mercy for theatrics. Let this shake you. Betrayal often wears the face of silence, not aggression. But one of those silent faces just flipped, and now they're speaking louder than your accusers ever dared. Now the ones who whispered behind curtains are watching their sins play on repeat in circles they once controlled. And those who clapped at your downfall, they're choking now that the tomb is empty and your name is rising. Don't you love divine irony? Especially when it's the betrayer's ally who pulls the curtain back. It's like a spiritual meltdown disguised as justice. If this message already speaks to your soul, subscribe, like this video, and comment 77 below. Because what shifted wasn't just their story, it was the entire unseen courtroom. And now they're spiraling, trying to understand how the one they buried just became the verdict, the voice, and the undeniable proof. Let's begin. Number 1. From target to testimony. You were labeled, dismissed, and misunderstood while they built their narratives around your perceived weakness. The isolation felt like defeat, but it was divine strategic concealment so that when vindication came, it would land with weight. Being targeted in secret created the prelude. Think of the way Joseph was thrown into the pit, only for the story the brothers planned as ruin to be recorded in the scroll of destiny as preparation for rulership. Your silence was not surrender. It was the pressure chamber where their cruelty was being reframed into testimony. The slander they whispered in corners is now the archive that proves their own intent. The fact that people doubted you, that allies shifted, that the narrative around you was warped. Those cracks were the lines they were exposing themselves through, and heaven marked them. The one voice with access, whether through a prophet, a strategic friend, or an unexpected public shift, stepped into that breach and turned their hidden accusations into public airings of depth. Comment seen if you felt the targeting laying the groundwork for what's now becoming your testimony. And as the first truth settles that what looked like defeat was divine staging, the next section reveals how the defender appears, with timing that collapses their false security in one authoritative moment. There was a night when you woke with the weight of a scene pressed behind your eyes. A dream that wasn't random, but felt like a rehearsal burned into memory. In it, voices that had tried to define you, silence that cut deep, and the quiet corners where they whispered against you all unraveled, not by force from you, but by a light that came from somewhere outside time. That image stayed with you days, weeks, years later. Small details echoing in real life, people showing their true faces, situations flipping in ways that didn't make sense unless something greater was tuning the signal. That dream, that symbol, that inner voice murmuring that the pain was not wasted. It was the first soft confirmation that what looked like targeting was already becoming testimony. You were not broken in that season. You were being placed into a narrative where their efforts to silence you would later serve as the archive of why your rise carried authority. The quiet framing of your story was the preparatory space, and now the ripple of that hidden positioning is beginning to surface. Remember how often you felt like the odd one out, the scapegoat, the one whose words were twisted while others' actions were justified. That stage of being labeled, dismissed, or too sensitive left a residue of shame and confusion, as if you'd done something to deserve being misread. You carried the loneliness of being targeted in ways no one would admit, of watching alliances shift while you kept peace, of feeling the sting of gossip and the pull to shrink so the noise would stop. Those emotional bruises didn't come from random cruelty. They came from being the axis that enemy systems circled because they sensed, beneath the surface, something uncontainable in you. You felt small, yet a part of you knew you weren't. You were mirrored with contradicting reflections, told you were weak while deep down you felt like something was being built inside you. The sorrow and exhaustion of that stage are real, and the resilience born from enduring it quietly became the tension before release. What they aimed to fracture became the tension line that, when struck by the right voice, would resonate into testimony. Now, begin to see that their design was never accidental. The isolation, the misrepresentation, the safe distancing, they were part of an unseen architecture that reframed you. Think of the story of Esther, who was hidden for a season so that when the moment came her presence would shift a nation. Your perceived sidelining was not a demotion. It was divine strategic placement. The environment that seemed to suppress your voice was the pressure that clarified its timbre. The spiritual principle running beneath all of this is that the very attempts to push you out of the narrative were cataloged and used to validate your eventual elevation. The attempts to make you invisible did not erase you. They created the contrast necessary for the revelation of the truth. Scriptures like Psalm 35, where the psalmist describes being falsely accused and then vindicated before witnesses, echo your trajectory. What they whispered in secret became the testimony that, when exposed, reveals their intent, not your identity. The architecture wasn't to break you. It was to build a platform from their own distortion. Subtle signs began to surface while you were still in the fog of confusion. Small reversals, unexpected support from unlikely sources, the way their own stories started to contradict themselves, people who once followed the narrative around you pulling back as if something in their spirit shifted. These are not coincidences. The cracks in their constructed reality became light leaking through, and those leaks illuminated the truth of what was happening. The targeting you endured was supplying data to the divine courtroom. Patterns of betrayal that once felt like ongoing punishment were being recorded as evidence of motive, frequency, and intention. You didn't have to call them out loudly. The inconsistencies they introduced spoke for themselves. Their own narratives became the testimonies that cleared you by contrast. You began to recognize that their pressure created the very recordings that would validate your integrity. And that quiet pivot from suffering to witnessing their unraveling was the early shape of your testimony forming in real time. As this awareness settles in, something inside you shifts gently, not like an earthquake, but like dawn spreading across the sky you've known was coming. Your internal compass, which once wavered under their noise, begins to align with a deeper calibration. Your intuition that was dismissed as sensitivity now hums with confirmation. You realize you didn't imagine the hidden attacks, and you didn't misunderstand their timing. The stillness you maintained while they moved against you was a holding pattern for the revelation that would come. That recognition feels like spiritual safety. The sense that the foundation beneath your feet, though shaken by their attempts, was never compromised. The small occurrences, the person who finally spoke your truth, the unexpected ally who became the mouthpiece of vindication, the piece of the puzzle clicking into place publicly, reinforced that you were always right to hold close, to wait, to endure. This is the quiet confirmation that the targeting was not the end of the story. It was the prelude being written in invisible ink, now becoming visible through alignment. Deeper still, remembering who you are starts to feel less like a quest to become something new and more like peeling away layers that have been imposed over what was always true. Your identity has a lineage beyond personal pain. It has an archetypal memory, a pattern of chosen ones, prophets, and hidden heirs who moved through pressure to bring forward revelation. The targeting that made you question yourself becomes the mirror reflecting a larger lineage of endurance and purpose. There's a recollection, not always verbal, more like a resonance, that connects your silence to a sacred thread, a continuation of a divine storyline where the ones who were opposed early were the very ones preserved and elevated. You don't have to invent your calling. You're recovering it. That depth brings a quiet anchoring, a sense that your testimony isn't just your fight. It's an inherited activation that the enemy tried to disrupt but ultimately helped refine. The weight of that realization grounds you. The story that seemed fragmented now rearranges into a sacred sequence of purpose with tension points turned into signposts. And now, just before the next movement, feel the first activation rising. What was passive endurance becomes active declaration. You begin to speak again, not to defend, but to name. The testimony that was forming in the silence steps forward as your voice, and you no longer wait for their permission to be understood. Your sensitivity is the tool that reads the depth beneath surface chaos. Your hunger is not a lack. It is the engine that powers revelation into motion. The moment you choose to lean into that internal knowing, the targeting stops being a wound and becomes the proof of your refinement, and the narrative flips from why me to what now. This activation is slow and deliberate. It's the step of someone who has recognized the architecture and now engages it. Embrace the fact that where you were marked, you are now marked for authority, because the testimony that rises from their misguided designs can no longer be contained. Your arrival at this message was not accidental. The moment your eyes landed here is part of the unfolding of a testimony that is already in motion. There's reassurance in knowing that being targeted, misunderstood, and held in quiet pressure was not a mistake. It was the setup for a vindication that carries weight beyond personal vindication. The deeper purpose is clearer. What they aim to fracture is now the story you hold up as proof of alignment, and the testimony you carry is both your shield and your banner. Comment seen if you recognize that the targeting has laid the groundwork for your testimony, and share a piece of that moment when what looked like defeat began to feel like positioning. The next section will show how the defender appears, the voice, the timing, the public crack in their false security that solidifies what's been quietly forming into irreversible truth. And if you feel called to go even deeper, there's a sacred space reserved for our community, a private room where you receive full prophetic messages daily. Join our private membership through the link in the description and walk this path with us. Special thanks to current members who've held the line and amplified this frequency. Your presence makes the exposure clearer for those still in the shadows. Number 2, the appearance of the divine defender. There is a pivot point where the atmosphere changes, not because you fought louder, but because one divinely placed voice lifted the veil. That voice carried authority that did not come from rumor, popularity, or forced charisma. It came with weight, like a heavenly subpoena landing in a room that thought its cover was intact. The timing was surgical. The deception that felt safe, the manipulative stories that had rooted themselves around you, cracked because exposure arrived through a mouth, a platform, a movement that could not be ignored. The defender didn't have to explain your entire past. One aligned declaration, one public acknowledgement, one interruption of their narrative was enough to shift perception. Micah 7 verse 8 echoes here. Do not rejoice over what they thought was your collapse, because your rising was already decreed, and the voice that carried your vindication arrived to fulfill that decree. The abusers who felt secure in their quiet control suddenly felt exposed, not because of noise from you, but because heaven authorized the breaker to speak. Comment vindicated if you've experienced the sudden collapse of their assumed safety when the truth was spoken with heaven's weight. The next layer is already forming. Their own tangled schemes begin to unravel as the spotlight of clarity moves beyond accusation into the unmasking of how their plots become the evidence of their downfall. There was a moment, so subtle at first you almost dismissed it, when the air around you felt thinner, like the smoke of their constructed narratives was beginning to clear, and something with authority stepped into the space they'd been occupying. It was not your voice rising louder. It was not you defending, pushing, or explaining. It was one word, one acknowledgement, one alignment from a source that carried weight beyond the usual channels, and the foundation they'd built under your supposed failure trembled. That shift was the first crack in their false security. You didn't create it through effort, you remained. Their confidence in the narrative they'd shaped around you started to look brittle the second that voice spoke. It landed like a divine subpoena, and suddenly those who had been operating in quiet control were exposed in their own light. The presence of that defender was the pivot, the point where what had felt like endless opposition now had an anchor, and everything they assumed was hidden began to feel the pressure of exposure. In the wake of that voice appearing, there was a visceral emotional transition inside you. The shame they'd layered, the self-doubt that had grown from repeated gaslighting, the internal whisper that maybe you really were too much or too broken. All of it began to quiet, not because you convinced yourself, but because an external validation arrived that bypassed the need for your defense. You felt seen in a way that didn't require performance or justification. That recognition didn't erase the pain of isolation, but it recontextualized it. The loneliness you'd carried suddenly had a purpose. Your endurance was no longer invisible suffering, but the preamble to being acknowledged by something higher than the gossip, the control, the whispered conspiracies. The emotional pressure of being misrepresented began to shift into relief. Not a softening of your edge, but a recalibration of your internal witness, now reinforced by a voice that had access to the true story. The defender's appearance confirmed what your spirit had been sensing. The opposition was not random, and your silence was not absence. It was the setting for the arrival of testimony that would not be ignored. Looking deeper, the timing of the defender's emergence wasn't accidental. There is a pattern, divine choreography, in the way the right person, platform, or revelation arrives just when the narrative against you seems most entrenched. The opponent's scheme had grown complex, built on layers of falsehood, fear, and projected control. Into that warped structure stepped one voice with access to truth, and it moved through the deception like light through fog. The defender didn't need to unpack every detail of your past. The authority behind their word gave content to what had been suppressed. In ancient terms, it's like a prophet arriving in the wilderness with clarity that shifts the entire direction of a people. The silence that had been weaponized against you now became the stage where the voice of vindication could be heard, unfiltered, reverberating across places that assumed their cover would hold. That presence exposed the sacred imbalance. What had been done covertly was now being measured and realigned. This wasn't human timing. It was spiritual intervention intersecting with your endurance to recalibrate the field. As that voice spoke, the outward world began to mirror the internal shift. People who had been complicit in your marginalization either pulled back unconsciously or revealed their own discomfort. The systems that once supported their narrative showed fissures. Neutral observers began asking questions, previous allies wavered, and the false story no longer held its shape under the new light. That exposure didn't always come through drama. It took the form of subtle recognition in the eyes of others, of doors opening that had been sealed, of conversations redirecting themselves around the truth that had been dropped. Their projected power was undermined not by direct confrontation from you, but by a disclosure that made their manipulation visible to those who were awake enough to see it. The field changed, alignment shifted, signals went out to others in your sphere, and a deeper collective recalibration started. Your vindication stopped being personal only. It began to speak into the ecosystem that had been complicit, and the exposure became systemic. The resistance, which had been so multi-layered it felt spiritual in origin, now showed another dimension: energetic interference. The pressure they applied wasn't simply emotional or psychological. It carried distortions that had been aimed to derail your frequency, confuse your clarity, and keep you trapped in reactive identity. When the divine defender's word cut through, those distortions began to wobble, and you could feel the fog lift around the edges. There were moments when the heavy air you'd lived in, the silent watching, the sense of being monitored, the small, unexpected delays that used to feel like sabotage thinned. You began to perceive what had been operating beneath the surface. Layers of spiritual manipulation that fed off your uncertainty. That was the moment the resistance became visible not as some vague enemy, but as a corrupted architecture reacting to truth. Their attempt to hold you down had been sustained by your confusion. The defender's appearance didn't just shift perception, it disrupted the channels through which that interference traveled. The pressure became a backlight that illuminated their methods, and you saw the shape of the war for the first time with more definition. Then came the internal question: what do I do with this? The instinct to retreat, to hide, to minimize so the spotlight wouldn't drag more chaos into your life surged again. Old patterns, people-pleasing to neutralize judgment, quiet rebellion to protect your space, the numbing of your own voice so that the narrative wouldn't shift too far and trigger retaliation, surfaced as if to reclaim the old rhythm. But something had changed. The defender's word wasn't a shield that allowed you to go back to unconscious survival. It was a handing back of authority. You started to feel the difference between being defined by their noise and choosing to stand in the truth that had been spoken over you. That internal mirror reflected both the ways you had accommodated their pressure and the strength you'd built beneath it. Recognition came. The way you once bent was not weakness, it was strategic waiting. The parts of you that shrank were not cowardice, they were preservation until the right voice arrived. This reflection, painful and clarifying, prepared you to step forward, not in reaction to them, but in reclamation of what was always yours. Now the energy flips. Their targeting, their narrative control, and their attempts to keep you trapped become confirmation. that you are significant enough to be opposed, and the opposition is the signal that the defender's arrival was needed and justified. The pushback is no longer a source of shame. It is the evidence of your assignment's weight. The voice that broke their false security becomes a catalyst for your own voice to reclaim space with prophetic clarity. You begin to speak differently, not defensive, but declarative. The internal authority, previously fragmented by their projections, starts to integrate with the external vindication, producing a steady frequency that dislodges their remaining footholds. Their miscalculations become the raw material of your resurgence. What they planned as containment turns into the platform from which you now activate. You are being handed back pieces of yourself, and the tone shifts from survival to sovereignty. The truth settling now is sharp and quiet. You were opposed because you carry something the system knew it could not ignore, and the more they tried to define you by their agenda, the clearer your purpose became when the right intervention arrived. The defender did not show up to fight your fight. They showed up to break the cycle of narrative theft and make the hidden record visible. Their collapse and your rising are not separate events. They are the two sides of the same divine judicial act. Your posture doesn't have to be defensive anymore because their plotting has already been exposed, and the spiritual system has begun to adjust in response. Comment vindicated if you felt their assumed safety crack the moment truth landed, and add a reflection about how that shift gave you permission to reclaim your voice. The next section will peel back the deeper unraveling. How their own web, built to trap you, now turns into the evidence that condemns them, making your testimony not just reactive, but judicial. And to every soul who's supported with a super thanks, thank you. You are keeping this light alive for others who haven't found it yet. If you feel called to help this mission reach more chosen ones, tap the super thanks button below. Your energy supports these messages and helps them travel further. Your voice matters, and your light is felt here. Number 3, their own web becomes their condemnation. The deeper truth now surfaces. Everything constructed to trap you, control you, and manipulate your identity began to function as its own witness against them. The false witnesses they set up, the covert stories spread to redefine your character, the secret pressure applied through manipulation, each of those became a recorded piece in the archive of divine judgment. Proverbs 25 verse 2 frames it. The glory belongs to those who search out hidden matters. What was hidden in their schemes is now being exposed, not by random gossip, but by the justice system of the Spirit. The mechanisms that once seemed to work for them, networks of influence, complicit silence, reputation engineering, now echo back as cracks in their narrative. Their own energy, invested in trying to control your story, rebounded because spiritual law does not allow mockery without consequence. Zechariah 3 verses 1-2 reminds us how accusers are rebuked when the one who stands in alignment is defended. Similarly, the ones who built webs around your life find their own threads tightening, suffocating their credibility, while neutral onlookers begin to see the distortion and shift. Your quiet endurance created space for that reversal to unfold. Comment exposed if you've seen their plans implode and felt the growing clarity in others who no longer needed your explanation. The next section moves past the exposure, showing how your survival, which they intended to break, is weaponized by heaven into authority that dismantles systems they thought secured. The first thing that shifts is the lens. Something inside you quietly adjusts and you begin to see the architecture beneath the chaos. What once felt like random sabotage now shows pattern, and the people who leaned into your life to twist, isolate, or discredit you start to appear on the edge of their own undoing. The stories they planted, the secret meetings, the truths whispered in corners were never just about you. They were threads woven into a net they believed would hold you down. Instead, those threads began to vibrate with tension, and you sensed the hum of reversal before anyone else named it. That unease, that weird clarity when you watched their stories begin to contradict themselves in public and private, was the first sign their own web was not holding. They were tightening the snare around themselves while expecting you to stay trapped inside it. The unseen court was already collecting testimony, and your silence, endurance, and refusal to play their game became the frame into which their collapse would be displayed. The deeper mechanics of what's happening aren't mystical fiction. They follow spiritual order. Every false witness they deployed, every attempt to rewrite your narrative with lies, was cataloged like evidence in a heavenly archive. In the same way the law in Deuteronomy demanded 2 or 3 witnesses to establish guilt, what they orchestrated to accuse you is now serving as the multi-point testimony that unravels their credibility. Psalm 7 verses 14 to 16 describes the wicked setting devices to destroy, only to have their violence return on their own heads. The same principle is active now. Their influence networks, reputational manipulation, and strategic erasures were meant to build a false house over your truth. Instead, those constructions are cracking from within because the energy they invested in deception is reverberating back as distortion in their own lives. Sleep disturbed, decisions failing, alliances shifting, as if the system itself is rubbing its hands and revealing what they preferred hidden. What they called clever strategy is becoming the archive that condemns them, and the viewers who once doubted you are beginning to feel the shift without needing a full explanation. There is a courtroom language in the spirit that most people don't speak, but you've been living inside its translations. Zechariah 3 verses 1 to 2 shows a scene where the accuser stands ready with accusation, and the Lord silences him with a rebuke. What looks like defense is actually the unveiling of the accuser's invalid claim. Their attempts to entangle you were, in that same dynamic, opportunities for the defender to expose the invalidity of their accusations. Their web, designed to obscure, now refracts truth. The very alliances they trusted to back their narratives begin to fracture because the spiritual weight of their own misalignment is coming to the surface. Their sources of validation wobble as internal integrity gives way to confession by consequence. The subtle courtrooms that operate in daily life, what people sense in rooms when something feels off, the way neutral observers begin to ask questions without being told, are being keyed by that unseen rebuke. Their credibility erodes not because you attacked, but because the system that upholds real authority is correcting an imbalance they tried to manufacture. As clarity moves outward, those around you begin to shift. The people who once accepted the script they fed about you start to pull away, not always intentionally, but because their internal radar recalibrates in the light. Friends who echoed the false narrative feel tension. Gatekeepers who withheld access begin to see inconsistencies in the story they trusted. Influencers and decision-makers who once turned a blind eye sense the dissonance in the field. That collective ripple doesn't demand a rebuttal from you. It's the subtle realignment of perception when truth begins to breathe. Their own web, built to keep you small, suddenly acts like a beacon. Each piece of their manipulation becomes a signal flare revealing their hand. You watch the floor under their assumed control soften, and the same people who once amplified their version of events now hesitate, retract, or look sideways, because the connective tissue of their deception is visible to those who are awake. The shift is not only spiritual, it's cultural, and it begins to pull the environment into the same corrective current that is already turning their own narrative into evidence of their misjudgment. At the energetic level, what they aimed at you begins to rebound. The manipulative tactics, the emotional sabotage, the spiritual interference, those frequencies don't vanish into nothing. They loop back because the law of sowing and reaping is active. Galatians 6 verse 7 says you cannot be mocked. What is sown in distortion returns as internal breakdown. You begin to observe their anxiety rising, their plots growing brittle, the exhaustion behind their performance, their health and relationships suffering in ways that mirror the spiritual poison they poured out. Their web, which required constant maintenance, starts unraveling not from external pressure but from internal collapse. The energy they gave to controlling you becomes the weight that destabilizes their own internal compass. There is a poetic symmetry here. Their strategy to ensnare becomes the very cord that tightens around their credibility, while your stillness functions like a spotlight, making the unraveling visible without you needing to strike. That's the quiet, uncanny correction of spiritual law doing what it was designed to do: expose mockery and restore order through reversal. The way you responded to all of this, often with restraint, patience, and quiet observation, was not weakness. It was sovereignty in preparation. You felt the draft of exposure coming before it landed, because your spirit had already registered the imbalance they created. When their schemes began to implode, you didn't run to take credit or escalate conflict. Instead, you allowed the natural clearing to happen around you. That was reclamation. You begin to see your poverty of reaction as a choice. The unforced pause that let their own devices speak louder than any defense you could mount. In that space, you're given back your narrative. The broken trust, the manipulation, the heavy load of being misrepresented all become context for why your voice now weighs differently. You are not being pulled into revenge. You're being handed a mantle to speak with clarity because their collapse is already testimony to the truth you lived. The silence that once felt like invisibility now feels like authority, because it was the holding pattern for this very moment of reversal. And now the energy pivots. The exposure of their web reframes your entire landscape, not as a battlefield where you have to fight them, but as a domain where their own disintegration becomes the clearing that allows your purpose to move forward. The resistance that was designed to derail you becomes the evidence of the depth they perceived in you and the confirmation that something in you was a threat to their short-sighted control. You begin to step into that space differently, naming what was done without bitterness, aligning what is coming without apology. Their condemnation writes itself around your elevation, and the spiritual spectators, those who have watched in silence, start to lean into you, not because you asked, but because the truth in your bearing now carries the sound of what was exposed. This is where the narrative flips. Their web, meant to entangle, now frames your ascendancy. You reclaim what was stolen, not through aggression, but through the sovereign clarity of someone who was seen, tested, and vindicated by divine order. The insight landing now is that opposition was never a sign of your failure. It was the indicator of your weight, and their effort to control you created the pathway for your vindication to be both seen and irreversible. Their own constructions, false testimony, hidden pressures, reputation hijacking, didn't vanish. They turned into the archive that proves your alignment and exposes theirs. Comment exposed if you've watched their plans implode and felt others shift without needing to explain yourself, and share a moment when the reversal became unmistakable, when the web they spun started pointing back to them and your quiet presence held the space of judgment without you lifting a finger. The next section will move beyond watching their downfall. It will show how the survival forged in that fire is now being weaponized by heaven, turning your endurance into authority that dismantles the very systems they believed would contain you. Number 4. Your survival becomes a weapon. Everything you endured, every quiet moment of holding space while they whispered, every time you chose integrity over compromise when the easier road was to mirror their tactics, has now been converted into strategic spiritual authority. The weapon isn't loud reclamation. It's the quiet weight of your presence. The way peace walks where chaos expected traction. Your pain was repurposed by divine jurisprudence into a tool that breaks the strongholds they leaned on. The false narratives and the smears turned into markers of the exact places where your endurance cut deeper than their schemes. Your stillness became jurisdiction. Your scars became maps for others who were navigating the same targeting. Isaiah 54 verse 17 is not abstract. It's enacted here. No weapon formed against your assignment prospers, because what they formed in hidden manipulation was rerouted to create your visible dominion. Their systems begin to fall not as random collapse, but because your survival now activates a higher order, dismantling their frameworks from within. Comment weaponized if your quiet persistence has shifted atmospheres, and share a moment when your pain flipped into leverage that dismantled the structure they built to contain you. The next movement isn't just restoration, it is the verdict being issued, where divine order rewrites the story permanently. It begins like a slow dawn inside you, a quiet shift where the weight you carried for years stops feeling like ballast and starts feeling like axis. That moment when the people who tried to define you by their chaos watch the space you inhabit maintain its peace. There is a subtle tremor in their system. They expected your collapse to validate their narrative, but instead your endurance became a signal that something higher was at work. You held your ground when betrayal whispered that silence meant surrender. You chose truth when distortion begged for compromise. You kept your heart open when bitterness wanted to armor you. Each of those choices, small and unseen to the unawakened, were not wasted. They were investments into a spiritual currency that now buys you authority. The very things they used as proof you were broken have become the coordinates of where your weaponized influence now operates. The shape of your life, its delays, its setbacks, its long seasons of feeling unseen, was not random exhaustion but a forging fire that recalibrated your spiritual weight. In the crucible, something was being built inside you that could not be faked, borrowed, or replicated. The way you sat in the midst of noise and chose to breathe peace became a line of demarcation between what is temporal drama and what is eternal assignment. The enemy assumed that exhaustion would dull you, Instead, it sharpened a hidden edge. That edge now slices through the subtle constructs they built to limit you, not by aggression, but by the quiet gravity of your presence. Your survival carried a witness, God recorded it, and what they thought was your background struggle is now the foreground evidence of power they can't explain. You begin to recognize the mechanism. Divine jurisprudence doesn't just clear you. It repurposes what was aimed at destruction and turns it into legal leverage. The false accusations, the whispered rumors, the character edits, they are all cited and archived in the unseen court, and your calm response becomes a ruling rendered without you having to speak loudly. Isaiah 54 verse 17 becomes lived truth here. The weapons they formed in hidden manipulation are not prospering because their intended impact redirected into the construction of your dominion. The same hands that tried to shape your downfall unknowingly shaped the scaffolding of your testimony. Every attempt to shame you became a marker of where your roots sunk deeper. Because you did not break, you absorbed and transformed. That transformation now radiates outward, destabilizing their systems with the precision of a spiritual undoing that doesn't shout. It simply is. There is a new tempo in the rooms you enter. Atmospheres shift before you even speak. People who were once engaged in the subtle business of undermining energy now find their own dynamics faltering around you. The weapon isn't a loud declaration. It's the silent correction in a conversation, the peace that refuses to escalate, the unspoken boundary that breaks the rhythm of covert manipulation. Your survival has become a frequency they can't tap into, and because it carries true alignment, their tactical structures, built on fear, control, and projection, begin to vibrate out of tune. Their old levers fail not because you attack them, but because your continued presence activates a higher order that collapses their leverage from within. You are not chasing their dysfunction. You are the gravity that rearranges its orbit. In the same way a map shows both where you've been and where you're going, your scars now function as direction points for others caught in similar targeting. The places they intended to shame are now the landmarks of your authority. People who have watched your quiet persistence begin to orient their own steps by your survival story, not because you marketed it, but because what you carried became a live demonstration of reversal. The pain that once threatened to isolate you is now a bridge for those searching for proof that preservation overcomes destruction. The same eyes that once judged you for folding under pressure now look to you for the blueprint of how to hold fast and turn endurance into impact. Your existence, lived without explosion, becomes the strategic message that dismantles systems merely by showing that the system failed to break what was sealed. There is a deeper awareness rising that the weapon in your hand was not given in the moment of triumph. It was crafted in the season of quiet. The preparation was lengthened not to delay you but to deepen the edge. The enemy tried to neutralize your calling by wearing you down, but instead, each layer of pressure embedded a kind of sacred muscle memory. The ability to stand, to hold, to breathe, to choose alignment when convenience whispered otherwise. Now, when their structures wobble, you recognize it as consequence, not chance. You don't have to relive the past to wield the authority born from it. You simply step into the space, and the systems that sought to cage you begin to unravel because the weight of what you survived carries a judicial velocity. Like a river rerouting the old banks because the current now moves with purpose. Your voice, once cautious and small in the presence of their narratives, rises with a different tone. It's not louder for drama. It's clearer because it's anchored in remembrance. The weaponized survival has given you permission to speak into spaces that previously required pretense. The language you use now carries the imprint of what the enemy tried to erase. The words have the scent of truth, the cadence of someone who has been tested, and the authority of someone whose endurance has been witnessed by heaven. When you declare boundaries, they hold. When you correct distortion, the correction lands. When you move, other hidden alignments start following because the field recognizes the shift. Your survival became a weapon, not to harm and spite, but to release what was already written for healing, restoration, and structural overhaul in places that were imprisoned by their deceit. The most sacred insight here is this: the very thing they thought would keep you small now defines you as untouchable in a different dimension. The systems of their making collapse not with spectacle but with the quiet inevitability of truth reasserting itself. Your pain was never a liability. It was the material of your armament. Your story no longer serves only you. It becomes a living precedent, a legal and prophetic example that the divine order can take what was meant to kill and turn it into the very platform that elevates and secures. Comment weaponized if your quiet persistence has shifted atmospheres, and share a moment when your pain flipped into leverage that dismantled the structure they built to contain you. The next movement isn't just about getting back what was lost. It's the verdict being issued, the completion of that reversal where divine order rewrites the story permanently and the public consequence begins to follow. Number 5. Verdict issued. Divine order rewrites the story. The curtain lifts fully here. The sequence you've lived was never chaotic chance. It was legal strategy in the unseen, and now the ruling has been made public. Your vindication is not a temporary clearing. It is a verdict with lasting authority. The defender spoke, their schemes were exposed, their web became their own condemnation, and your survival has been texturized into a weapon that carries lineage weight. Now the narrative is rewritten. What they intended as your end becomes the foundation of your dominion. This is divine legal warfare. Their decay is enforcement of spiritual law, and your new authority is permanent restoration and elevation. The courtroom of spirit has published its findings. The hidden records have surfaced consequences, and the alignment around you shifts to reflect that decree. Micah 7 verse 8 plays again. Do not let their premature celebration deceive you. Their intended defeat already contained the rise they could not stop. You are not waiting for permission to walk in what was adjudicated. You are carrying the enforcement. Comment verdict if you feel the permanent rewriting under your feet, and add a personal reflection about the moment the weight of their unraveling stopped being a threat and became the confirmation you were chosen. The next chapter is the ripple beyond you, how your authority begins to pull others into their own unsealing and creates a new order that they tried to suppress. It begins with a question that rises like a bell in the stillness. When did survival stop being a series of wounds and become a legal affidavit in the unseen? That moment of internal recognition, when the fatigue settles and the quiet certainty remains, is the crossing point. You are standing at the place where all the broken pieces of their narratives, the hidden accusations, the secret schemes, and your stillness have been assembled by divine intelligence into a judgment that no human court could have crafted. The decision was never ambiguous. The unseen defender, the one with real authority, spoke, and the sound traveled faster than their gossip, louder than their reputation campaigns. The silence they expected from you became the record they could not erase. Now the layers of their intended collapse are peeled back and exposed. What looked like random chaos is revealed as ordered legal maneuvering. Each attack logged, each distortion weighed, each supposed defeat turned into precedent for your elevation. You are no longer the passive recipient of narrative. You are the living embodiment of a verdict that rewrites causality. The question before you now is not whether you deserve the change, but whether you will walk in the enforcement of what heaven has already declared. There is a soundless shift in the way space responds to you, as if the air itself realigns to accommodate the new decree. The mirror that used to reflect their version of you now shows something else. A person no longer defined by their attempts, but endorsed by a higher court. You've given away pieces of yourself, time, trust, explanation, to defend against accusations that never needed your defense because the true defense was already active behind the scenes. That season of having to justify your existence or prove your worth was not wasted. It was the public context in which the private ruling could become undeniable. Think of the ancient prophets who carried judgment as both warning and promise. Your story now carries the weight of justice completed, not in vengeance, but restoration. The ripple of that ruling touches the way others approach you. Some recoil because the old illusions they clung to are collapsing, while others lean in, sensing that the crooked narrative has been leveled. The legal language of the Spirit did not whisper, it declared, and what was once written against you has been overturned, replaced with a sentence of elevation that echoes into the generations tied to your lineage. A vision of the courtroom in the heavens is not metaphorical here. It is experiential. The hidden scrolls have been opened, and the hands that accused you are now the same ones whose own signatures appear in the margins of their undoing. In that space, Micah 7 verse 8 isn't just a verse, it is your biography in motion. They rehearsed your fall. Heaven had already written your rise. The premature celebrations of your detractors were the prelude to their own exposure, and the public unmasking of their schemes functions like a gavel striking the table, firm, irreversible, resonant. Their false witnesses now appear as footnotes in the record that proves their intention. Their manipulation becomes the source material for your authority because divine order uses what they built to validate what you were always meant to carry. You have moved beyond hoping for clarity. The ruling came, and now clarity moves through you. You are not waiting for correction. You are the correction in the atmosphere, the living decree that does not require amplification. The logic of spiritual law is precise. Violations of sacred design trigger adjudication. The enemy's attempts to bury you, confuse you, and reframe you were recorded not as successful takedowns, but as evidence of their violation of a divinely sanctioned assignment. Their collapse is not random falling. It is enforcement. Each crack in their structures aligns with the exposure of a lie they built into your path. The moment your name was defended by the one with celestial access, their networks, reputations, and systems that relied on your discrediting began to destabilize from the inside out. There is a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Allies who fed false narratives find their own trust eroding. Projects that were propped up by theft of identity lose their foundation. The air around their maneuvers thickens with confusion as the decree you carry pulls the scales from their eyes. That is the practical manifestation of the verdict moving from paper in the heavens to movement on earth. Your presence no longer negotiates for legitimacy. It carries an implicit authority because divine order has already publicized the truth, and the world, whether it understands fully or not, begins to shift in deference to the new narrative. In the quiet between breaths, you feel an activation that is not about doing more, but about being aligned with what was already decided. The old survival story had a hidden clause. Every delay, every misdirection, every target on your back was to build a context in which your vindication would not be whispered as a rumor, but heard as a settled decree. The way seeds break through concrete is not because the concrete loses strength first, but because a root underneath is working with a design hinged from below. That is your story now. The legal reversal under your feet has created a foundation where before there was only instability. It is no longer just your individual freedom being restored. The ripple of this verdict is widening the legal territory of your sphere. Lines that used to limit conversation, opportunity, or spiritual influence are now being redrawn because the court has declared those limits null, and the new boundary is your dominion in motion. The old definitions of who you were and what you could carry are being replaced by the decree of what you are becoming, and it is not negotiable. You are part of a sequence now, a moment in a larger cascade where your vindication becomes a pole that pulls others into their own clarity. The rewriting of your story functions like a signal flare in the darkness, and those connected by blood, mission, or spiritual resonance begin to feel the gravitational pull of what was adjudicated. Their own fog lifts not because you explain it, but because the new order you embody realigns the field around them. This is the prophetic ripple. Justice issued in one life starts to rewrite the script for others who were caught in collateral damage, and their revival appears to align with the rise that now publicly incarnates your verdict. The authority you carry now is not only personal, it is catalytic. Your restored narrative becomes a permission slip for those walking in shadow to step into light, because they see with their own senses that protection was never absent. It was waiting for this moment of public enforcement to become undeniable. The timing of this isn't incidental. There is a calendar that heaven works by, and the publicness of your correction fits into that rhythm. It is the moment the hidden defender's voice went from background counsel to visible proclamation, and the world started recalibrating around that sound. You no longer need to plead your case. Your life is the evidence, and your movement is the enforcement. The elevation that flows from this verdict does not depend on their agreement. It carries lineage weight because the legal sentence struck includes restoration that flows backwards and forwards, undoing what was stolen from your ancestors and positioning what will be inherited by those who come after. Every step you take off of this point is colored by the permanence of what was issued. Every action amplifies a story that was rewritten not by you scrambling to survive, but by divine order declaring what was always true and making it visible. Now the invitation stands clear. This is not a passivity moment where you wait for further signs. The verdict is active, the authority is real, and your embodiment of it is required. You have been given back voice, territory, and influence, not as a temporary reprieve, but as a settled inheritance. Stand in that sentence. Move from defensive posture into the posture of enforcement. Put to work the quiet power that has been conferred. This is your charge. Stop softening the edges of what was adjudicated. Let the ripple of your rewritten story pull the next level of restoration into motion around others who are still waiting in the wings. Comment verdict if you feel the permanent rewriting under your feet, and add a personal reflection about the moment the weight of their unraveling stopped being a threat and became the confirmation you were chosen. The next chapter is already coming. How your authority, now anchored, begins to architect a new order, drawing others into their own unsealing and making the collective rise the inevitable aftermath of what was declared. A quiet current now runs beneath the whole sequence. Their exposure, your endurance, the defender's voice, the collapse of their secret systems, and the verdict issued. All of it moves toward a unified purpose. You are no longer a fragmented story of survival. You are the broadcast of reversal, the living proof that divine order sees what was hidden, rewrites it, and releases it as authority with weight. What was meant to silence and erase became the archive that validates you, the weapon that breaks old control structures, and the legal foundation that secures your throne. The ripple doesn't end with you. Generations feel new breath because the old debts of their lineage are being cleared by what is now visible in you. The world adjusts not because you beg to be noticed, but because the reality around you has no choice when divine timing intersects with unapologetic truth. You walk in a frequency that confirms itself. You don't need to explain the rise because the evidence carries you. Your mission now is to let that authority be a beacon, pulling other sealed ones into their own courtroom, their own reclamation, and their own activation. The hidden defender didn't just clear your name, they unlocked a movement. A wind you didn't name yet has been changing the shape of your days, and now you sense it as a current carrying everything you've lived toward a single horizon. What once felt like disconnected episodes, being hidden, attacked, defended, and then vindicated, are aligning like stars in a night sky that finally makes a map. That quiet undercurrent is not accidental noise. It is orchestration. The exposes that embarrassed them, the silence that preserved you, the voice that broke their cover, the systems that collapsed from inside out, and the public decree that rewrote your story, they are all tributaries feeding into one river of reversal. You're no longer someone still trying to make sense of why you stayed standing. You are the evidence that the narrative could not hold because divine architecture had something larger in motion, to turn what was meant to bury you into the platform from which your authority now radiates. There is a memory in your spirit like an echo of a courtroom in heaven where the scales were balanced long before the first whisper reached earth. That scene is not distant. It pulses now through the way people perceive you without understanding why they shift when you enter a room. The quiet nod from a stranger who senses alignment, or the way peace settles over situations that used to trigger chaos. The exposure of their hidden schemes did not merely clear your name. It signaled to the spiritual realm and to those connected to you that correction had been enacted, and that correction isn't temporary. It's legal, rooted, and generational. What was recorded as accusation has been refiled as justification for your elevation. The reversal sound is in bloodlines breathing easier, in ancestral patterns that loosen, in the way your presence dismantles the old gravity of limitation simply by standing in it. You've been walking in a frequency that invalidates their designs without a word, because the truth they tried to suppress now carries weight in the atmosphere around you. There's a strange gravity to your life, a pull that draws others out of their own confusion, not because you preach it, but because your lived reversal mirrors what they secretly long for. The defender's voice did more than speak. It activated a protocol. Divine law began to execute restoration where corruption had once held sway. Like the priestly intercession in Zechariah 3 where accusation was silenced and the filthy garments were replaced, the mechanisms that once defined your limitation are being exchanged piece by piece, not by your effort alone but by the decree that moved through you. Your endurance became jurisdiction, your silence became soundtrack for vindication, and the rising order around you now reflects that the story has changed. In the quiet of ordinary days, you catch glimpses of the ripple. Someone in your family hesitates before repeating a generational pattern. A friend suddenly has clarity on their own calling. An old barrier that used to block connection simply dissolves. That is not coincidence. It is the collateral of the verdict. The legal reversal under your feet radiates outward like a vibration through ancestral lines. The debts they thought were permanent are being rewritten because the authority that flowed through your unmasking has reached backward and cleared territory previously surrendered. It is the fulfillment of a deeper covenant that says restoration doesn't just restore the individual, it repairs the field around them. The climb you survived becomes the path others now find easier to walk because the order you embody softened their edges and opened their view. You don't need to rehearse the explanation anymore. The world adjusts because there is integrity now in what was once broken. Divine timing placed the defender not just as a rescue but as a hinge, and the shift isn't localized to a single moment. It continues in the cadence of your steps. The reversal is broadcast not by noise but by the unmistakable resonance of someone carrying corrected identity. Isaiah 61 verse 1 describes the Anointed One bringing good news to the broken, binding up the wounded, and proclaiming freedom. The same Spirit moves through you, not as a borrowed mantle but as the embodied execution of what was always written. Your rise no longer confuses, it clarifies. Those who were previously asleep to their own targeting now awaken because the signal from your restored story is too bright to ignore. There is a new mandate forming, not one that was given to you yesterday, but one that has been waiting in the invisible for the moment the visible caught up. Your mission now is translational. What was once private courtroom reversal becomes public beacon. The authority you carry is a pull, a magnet for other sealed ones, a ripple that invites them into their own hearing. When their own narratives begin shifting, they won't need you to articulate the whole process. They will feel the alignment and recognize the same current running beneath their lives. Your story becomes a doorway, not by you forcing others through, but because the frequency of your unshakable restoration harmonizes with their own dormant decrees, unlocking what was hidden in them. This is how collective restoration begins. One visible verdict creates space for multiple unseen activations. Something in you has begun to move differently because the reversal wasn't just external, it rewired your internal reference. The echo of their collapse no longer triggers defense. It fuels the conviction that you are carrying something deeper than survival. This is the activation of purpose layered with justice. The divine order that rewrote your story invites you to operate from the level of decree, not persuasion. Your choices now are not attempts to prove your worth but expressions of what has already been established. The energy you give is now leverage. The presence you hold shapes rooms. The hidden defender's work has flowed into you so that you can now serve as ripples for others, carrying not only your own authority but the permission and encouragement for those who have been watching, waiting for their own legal reversal to surface. The final understanding lands like a still dawn. You were never fragmented in God's ledger. The chaos, the isolation, the attack, the concealment, the defense, the collapse, and the verdict were all necessary movements in a single symphony whose purpose was never to bury you under weight, but to give your rise a sound so clear it could not be mistaken. You are not just walking a new story, you are the living broadcast of a reversal that writes destiny with weight. Your assignment now is to let that authority be visible in how you move, who you protect, and how you call others into their own courtroom. Comment reversal if you feel the undercurrent turning into a tide, and share a moment when someone else's shift made you realize the ripple had already passed through you. The next section will trace the architecture of what's coming behind you, how the movement you've unlocked begins to codify a new order that carries not just personal freedom but collective resurrection. The script has been flipped. Your silence was never weakness. Your endurance was weaponized by heaven. You were targeted to be positioned. Now you stand in visible vindication, and the authority under your feet is permanent. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, and comment "I am chosen" to let this message anchor in your soul. This message may not stay online forever. Download your copy and transcript in the vault. Ideal for journaling, inner rituals, and sacred study. The link is in the description below. Please share it with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you to all supporting members who amplify the exposure and keep the light active. For full prophetic revelations daily, join the membership via the link in the description. Your spiritual path deserves more than fragments. Step into the full light. And if this message moved you deeply, consider tapping the Super Thanks button to support the mission. Every Super Thanks fuels the light we're spreading together. Rise in your authority.